The room in Stockholm had felt almost ceremonial as Alfred Nobel, frail and often ill, signed his will on November 27, 1895. 4 witnesses observed in silence while he outlined, in careful legal language, the fate of his immense fortune. Nearly all of it, amassed through patents and factories devoted to explosives, was to be placed in a fund. Its annual interest, he decreed, would reward those who had given the greatest benefit to humanity. When the contents of the will became public after his death in 1896, newspapers across Europe reacted with astonishment and outrage. Editorials recalled obituaries from a few years earlier that had condemned Nobel as a merchant of death, a man who had grown rich by making war more deadly. Now this same industrialist was establishing prizes for science, literature, and most provocatively, for the promotion of peace. Motives were debated fiercely and endlessly. Behind the controversy lay an invention that had changed both industry and warfare: dynamite. 3 decades earlier, Nobel had experimented with nitroglycerin, a powerful but dangerously unstable liquid that had already caused fatal explosions. By mixing it with an absorbent material to create a pale yellow clay-like substance, then wrapping it in paper cartridges, he had made blasting more controllable and transportable. This seemingly simple transformation had turned rock to dust and resentment into lasting guilt. The story of dynamite led back to 1847, inside a laboratory at the University of Turin. Italian chemist Ascanio Sobrero experimented with glycerin and a mixture of nitric and sulfuric acids, searching for new compounds. What emerged was a clear, oily liquid, nitroglycerin. When small samples detonated, they shattered glassware, scarred benches, and injured nearby assistants. The substance's ferocity exceeded anything chemists had handled, announcing a new and deeply unsettling kind of explosive. Shaken by the violence he had unleashed, Sobrero condemned his own discovery. He warned colleagues that nitroglycerin was too unstable for any practical application, insisting it should never be manufactured on a large scale. In lectures and papers, he described its sensitivity to shock and temperature, and he concealed key procedural details. Yet, curiosity proved stronger than caution. News of the compound circulated through European laboratories, reaching military engineers and industrial chemists fascinated by its power. Meanwhile, Europe industrialized at a relentless pace. Railways cut through mountains, mines sank deeper, and new nation-states sought strategic advantages. Engineers needed stronger explosives to blast rock and drive tunnels. In this climate, the dangerous liquid Sobrero feared appeared less a monstrosity than an opportunity. Among those who encountered the reports was the son of a Swedish engineer, Alfred Nobel. Where Sobrero saw only catastrophe, Nobel perceived a tool that might reshape both warfare and industry. Alfred Nobel's story began in Stockholm, in a household where ideas often outpaced income. His father, Emanuel Nobel, struggled through bankruptcies yet persisted as an inventive engineer, experimenting with mines and mechanical devices. When contracts in Sweden dried up, the family moved to Russia, where Emanuel secured work for the imperial military. In St. Petersburg, Alfred received a cosmopolitan education in chemistry, physics, and engineering, tutored privately while absorbing his father's restless ambition. Emanuel's underwater mines, designed to defend Russian waters, seemed promising during the Crimean War, but the conflict's end abruptly undercut demand. Military orders vanished, creditors pressed in, and the once busy workshops fell silent. The Nobel enterprise in Russia collapsed, scattering the family's prospects. Alfred, already fascinated by powerful chemical reactions, returned to Sweden with a sharpened resolve. He had heard of nitroglycerin, a new and fearsome liquid explosive, and he became fixated on harnessing it for blasting rock. In Stockholm, Alfred began experimenting with nitroglycerin on a modest scale, testing detonators and charges in secluded areas. The work soon moved to a shed at Helenborg, on a small islet, where he, his younger brother Emil, and a few assistants labored in cramped, makeshift conditions. They handled bottles that could explode from a jolt, enduring misfires, sudden shocks, and shattering blasts. Each test seemed to balance on a knife edge between discovery and disaster, as tension quietly mounted toward tragedy. On September 3, 1864, a violent detonation ripped through the Nobel family's makeshift nitroglycerin factory on the shores of Lake Mälaren. The small wooden buildings, hastily adapted for chemical work, disintegrated in an instant. The explosion killed Emil Nobel and 4 workers, hurling debris into the water and countryside. Shockwaves shattered windows across Stockholm, and residents felt the ground tremble as a new and terrifying substance announced its presence. Investigators and city authorities quickly descended on the devastated site. The blast, linked to unstable nitroglycerin, ignited a wave of fear. Newspapers across Sweden denounced the Nobel's experiments as reckless and immoral, questioning why such work had been allowed so near the capital. Under pressure, officials banned the manufacture of nitroglycerin within Stockholm's limits, turning the tragedy into a national scandal and placing the Nobel name under intense public scrutiny. Alfred Nobel, mourning his brother's death and facing mounting hostility, refused to abandon the explosive that had caused such devastation. Instead, he moved production onto anchored barges and isolated locations, distancing his operations from crowded streets and fragile windows. The catastrophe hardened his resolve. He now pursued a single aim: to tame nitroglycerin's volatility. Experiment by experiment, he searched for a way to stabilize its force and prevent future disasters like Lake Mälaren. In the mid-1860s, near Hamburg, a shipment of nitroglycerin reportedly leaked during transport or storage. Instead of pooling as a deadly liquid, part of it soaked into nearby barrels of kieselguhr, a fine chalk-like earth composed of fossilized diatoms. When Alfred Nobel examined the soaked material, he found that the dangerous fluid had become a damp, clay-like mass that could be pressed and shaped, something previously impossible with pure nitroglycerin. Nobel began systematic experiments with the new mixture. He adjusted the ratio of nitroglycerin to kieselguhr, pressed the paste into uniform cylindrical sticks, and dropped, struck, and transported them to test their stability. The absorbent earth reduced the explosive's sensitivity to accidental shocks, yet preserved its destructive force. To ensure reliable ignition, he refined the detonator concept he had pioneered earlier, seeking a precise way to trigger the stabilized explosive on command. The solution involved a wooden dowel into which a small metal blasting cap was inserted. When placed into a cartridge of the nitroglycerin kieselguhr mixture and fired, the cap provided the sharp detonation needed to set off the charge. In 1867, Nobel patented this invention under the name dynamite, from the Greek dynamis, meaning power. Public demonstrations impressed engineers and officials as they watched calm handling transform into controlled, massive, rock-shattering blasts. Across Europe and North America, dynamite quickly reshaped the ambitions of civil engineering. Railroads, canals, and mountain roads that had advanced only slowly with black powder suddenly pushed forward at unprecedented speed. Contractors rewrote their schedules, calculating tunnel lengths and cuttings no longer in decades but in years. Government officials and military observers watched closely, noting how this new explosive multiplied the effectiveness of small work crews and reduced the cost of attacking solid rock barriers. Nowhere did this transformation appear more dramatically than at the Mont-Cenis tunnel under the Alps, linking France and Italy. Engineers had already experimented with compressed air rock drills and black powder, but progress remained painfully slow. With the introduction of dynamite, the rhythm of the work changed. Crews drilled boreholes in careful patterns, tamped in wax dynamite cartridges, wired detonators, and retired behind rock shelters. Timed blasts shattered far more granite per round, cutting excavation times and bringing the tunnel's completion steadily closer. In the United States, dynamite drove railroad lines and deep mining operations into the American West. In gold, silver, and coal districts, workers drilled blast holes in tight stopes and open quarries, pushed in cartridges, attached fuses or electric detonators, then cleared the workings before coordinated shots. Reports celebrated record daily footage and ore tonnage, and praised dynamite's stability compared with loose nitroglycerin. Yet newspapers from remote camps also described fatal mishandling, storage fires, and accidental explosions that revealed its ever-present danger. By the late 19th century, Alfred Nobel's dynamite network stretched across Europe and the Atlantic. New factories rose in Germany, the United States, the United Kingdom, and other industrial hubs, often operating under complex licensing arrangements. Patent portfolios expanded as Nobel refined his inventions, turning volatile nitroglycerin into ever more manageable products. Financial ledgers and preserved letters showed how he bargained with governments and powerful industrial consortia, leveraging exclusive rights and local partnerships to secure markets and outmaneuver rivals. Innovation remained at the core of this growing empire. Nobel's development of gelignite, a more stable gelatinous explosive and later blasting gelatin, extended dynamite's power and versatility. Improved detonators and fuses allowed miners and engineers to control blasts with greater precision, reducing accidents while increasing efficiency. These technical advances reinforced his reputation as the Dynamite King, a figure whose patents framed the legal landscape of explosives. Around his factories, specialized testing grounds and laboratories continually evaluated new formulations and manufacturing techniques. Military observers soon studied these civilian explosives with intense interest. Naval engineers experimented with torpedoes and mines, incorporating nitroglycerin-based charges, while artillery designers tested shells packed with dynamite derivatives. Although black powder and later smokeless propellants still dominated battlefield propellant use, states gradually integrated Nobel's technologies into selected munitions and demolition tasks. Procurement documents and trial reports revealed how armies and navies weighed cost, stability, and destructive power, blurring the boundaries between peaceful infrastructure building and instruments of war. By the 1880s, dynamite had slipped from quarries and rail cuttings into the shadowy world of revolutionary politics. In Britain, Irish nationalist conspirators mounted what became known as the Fenian Dynamite Campaign. They attempted coordinated explosions against symbolic targets, government offices, railway hubs, even stations on the young London Underground. Crude timing devices and stolen detonators turned crowded platforms and tunnels into potential battlegrounds, shocking a public that had associated dynamite with distant engineering works. On the European continent, anarchist groups embraced dynamite as a weapon of spectacle. In Barcelona, bombs exploded in public spaces and at religious processions, feeding a cycle of repression and retaliation that scarred the city's working-class districts. In Paris, cafes, theaters, and government buildings became targets of small but devastating charges. Each attack left fragments of casing and traces of explosive. Yet investigators struggled to connect these clues to secretive networks that moved easily across porous borders. Across the Atlantic, dynamite featured in spectacular robberies, labor conflicts, and acts of sabotage against railroads and mines in the United States. Police reports and trial transcripts described stolen blasting cartridges, improvised caps, and crude instructional pamphlets. Detectives collected scorched wires and fragments of clockwork, but they rarely intercepted plots before detonation. From his residences in Paris and later Italy, Alfred Nobel read such accounts with growing unease as newspapers recast his invention from industrial marvel to emblem of terror. In 1888, confusion surrounded the death of Ludwig Nobel in Cannes. Several French newspapers mistakenly believed Alfred Nobel himself had died. Obituary columns swiftly condemned him, crystallized in a striking headline, "Le marchand de la mort est mort." Articles claimed he had amassed a fortune by discovering ways to kill more people, more quickly than ever before. The error abruptly revealed how parts of European society perceived his explosives empire. In the years that followed, Nobel's private letters showed a man wrestling with this image. He described feelings of loneliness and estrangement, and worried that history might remember only weapons and destruction. At the same time, he argued that more terrible armaments could make war unthinkable by raising its cost beyond endurance. This belief in deterrence, combined with his moral unease, pushed him to consider how his estate might serve a different legacy. On 27th of November 1895 in Paris, Nobel quietly signed a will that redirected most of his fortune into a fund. The document specified yearly prizes for achievements in physics, chemistry, physiology, or medicine, literature, and the promotion of peace. When he died in San Remo in 1896, the will shocked relatives and officials. Legal challenges and diplomatic negotiations followed, contrasting sharply with the careful, solitary way he had transformed dynamite profits into a call for humanitarian progress. By the early 20th century, dynamite's dominance had quietly faded. Chemists and engineers had developed trinitrotoluene, TNT, more stable, easier to cast into shells and better suited to mechanized warfare. In mines and quarries, ammonium nitrate-based blasting agents, mixed on site in huge quantities, replaced sticks of classic dynamite. Plastic explosives, pliable and powerful, entered specialized military use. Yet in newspapers, speeches, and everyday language, the word dynamite still described any force of sudden transformative change. Beneath expanding cities, high explosives carved subway tunnels, sewer lines, and underground rail links, while in remote regions they opened mountain passes and canal cuts. Hydroelectric dams, with their colossal spillways and diversion tunnels, relied on controlled blasting to reshape entire river valleys. The same chemistry powered wartime demolition of bridges and bunkers, and, in darker episodes, fed mining disasters and terrorist attacks in which dynamite-type charges turned tools of progress into engines of grief. Archival film showed peaks blasted for railways, lock gates closing on new canals, and highways threading through rock once considered impassable. Intercut with these images, scenes from Nobel Prize ceremonies in Stockholm and Oslo traced a different legacy of the same fortune drawn from stabilized nitroglycerin. Awards in physics, chemistry, medicine, literature, and peace continued to honor human achievement, embodying the enduring paradox of Alfred Nobel's invention, an explosive that reshaped stone and then reshaped humanity's moral and scientific horizons.